The dog went for the soldier's throat at midnight. Not a growl first. Not a warning stance. Just 80 pounds of trained Belgian Malinois hitting the door of room 7 like a freight train, and the entire night staff of Westbridge Military Medical Center scrambling backward into the hallway. 4 soldiers couldn't hold him. A 5th tried a sedation protocol, and the dog shredded the attempt before anyone finished the sentence. By 12:17 a.m., the facility commander was on the phone with SEAL Command, requesting emergency extraction of the animal. 12:19, a nurse named Emily Carter had already walked through the door, and the dog had gone completely still. This story already has you gripping your seat. Subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The night had started the way most nights started at Westbridge. Controlled chaos. The kind that looked organized from the outside, but felt like barely managed collapse from the inside. Emily had been pulling a double shift since 3 in the afternoon, which meant she'd already charted 42 patient notes, argued with a pharmacy tech over a dosing discrepancy that turned out to be her fault, and eaten half a protein bar over a sink in the break room, while simultaneously checking a post-op patient's drainage output. She was not having a good shift. She was having the kind of shift that reminded her why she'd once thought about quitting nursing entirely. Westbridge Military Medical Center sat at the edge of a sprawling federal installation about 40 miles outside of Carlin, Nevada, a facility most civilians didn't know existed, and most military personnel tried not to be sent to. It wasn't a punishment posting exactly, but it wasn't a plum assignment either. It was the kind of place that received patients other facilities weren't equipped for: classified injuries, soldiers with wounds that required documentation in controlled environments, operators whose treatments couldn't be logged in any standard system. Emily had been there 14 months. She'd learned quickly that the best way to survive the politics of a place like Westbridge was to keep her head down, do her job well, and not ask questions she didn't need the answers to. That policy had worked fine until tonight. She was halfway through a medication round on the recovery ward when she heard it, not the barking, which she'd heard distantly from across the building, but the change in the barking. There was a difference. If you'd spent enough time around working dogs, between a dog that was reacting and a dog that was communicating, most people couldn't hear it. Emily heard it immediately, the way you hear a song you haven't thought about in years and know every word before the second note. She finished hanging the IV bag, capped it, stripped her gloves, and walked toward the sound. The hallway outside the Secure Animal Recovery Unit, a small wing that most staff called the K9 Suite, half-joking, was a wreck. 2 soldiers had their backs against the opposite wall, looking genuinely rattled. Third was holding a compress against a gash on his forearm that wasn't serious, but was bleeding enough to be dramatic. A 4th was on the radio. A 5th, a staff sergeant whose name tag read Mulvane, was standing in front of the door with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had decided this situation was completely beyond his available tools and was now simply waiting for someone to blame. "What happened?" Emily asked. Mulvane looked at her. He had that particular way of looking at nursing staff that some soldiers developed, the one that categorized them as support personnel and filed them mentally under not relevant to immediate problem. "Dog went aggressive," he said, like that was both sufficient and final. "Dog, the SEAL asset Coda. He's been in recovery 3 days post-op on his left rear leg, been calm the whole time." Mulvane shook his head. 20 minutes ago, he started going absolutely insane. We tried to check on him. He went for Torres. He nodded toward the soldier with the arm compress, nearly took the door off the hinges when Rickman tried the secondary handle. Emily looked at the door. There was a dent in the lower panel that hadn't been there this morning. "Has anyone contacted his handler?" "Handler's still in the field. Extraction isn't until 0600. Mulvane's jaw tightened. "Command's already talking about pulling the animal. If we can't control him—" "You can't control him," Emily said, not unkindly. "It's not what's happening." Mulvane stared at her. "Excuse me?" She didn't answer. She was already moving toward the door. "Nurse," Mulvane said, his voice dropping to the register men use when they're about to explain something to someone they've already decided won't understand it. "That dog has injured one of my soldiers. He is not safe to approach. I am not going to stand here and let a civilian—" "Then don't stand there," Emily said. She wasn't rude about it. She wasn't performing anything. She said it the same way she would have said the charts in the drawer, like it was simply a fact about where things were located. Put her hand flat on the door. The barking stopped, tapered, not gradually settled. Stopped, the way a light stops when you cut the power, completely and immediately. The hallway went so quiet Emily could hear the hum of the fluorescent light above her and the sound of Torres's slow exhale. pushed the door open. Coda's was a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois who had been with SEAL Team Bravo for 3 years and had completed 4 overseas deployments, 2 of which involved sustained combat operations in environments Emily was not cleared to know the specifics of. She knew his file because she'd been assigned to his post-operative care when he came through 4 days ago, a deep laceration on his left rear leg that had nicked the gastrocnemius muscle and required surgical repair. Quiet, cooperative, and calm through all of it, didn't even flinch when she changed his bandages. Surprised her, because working dogs in pain were often unpredictable. She'd liked him immediately. He was standing now in the center of the room, not in his kennel. His ears were up. His body was rigid in the way that wasn't aggression. It was attention, full and complete, the posture of a dog reporting something rather than threatening it. The laceration dressing was still intact. He'd somehow managed to be absolutely violent in the hallway without re-injuring himself. Emily crouched down. She didn't call his name. She didn't reach for him. She just dropped to his level and waited. Coda turned his head and looked at her. Then he walked to her. Not fast, deliberately. Put his nose against her palm for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and looked at the wall to his right. Emily looked at the wall, then she looked back at Coda. "Okay," she said quietly. "I see you." She stood up slowly, moved to where he was looking, and put her hand against the wall. Concrete. Standard hospital construction. Nothing visible. But the ventilation grate in the lower right corner was slightly off. Not missing, not obviously tampered with, but the lower left screw was sitting at a slightly different angle than it would be if it had been installed and left alone, like it had been removed and replaced. Recently. She didn't touch it. She turned back to Coda, who was watching her with the focused, unblinking intensity of a dog, waiting to see if the human had finally understood. "Good boy," she said, and she meant it. Came out of the room, and Mulvane was right there, 3 feet from the door, radiating the energy of a man who had spent the last 4 minutes preparing a speech. "What just happened?" he demanded. "He's calm now," Emily said. "Can stand down the extraction call." "I'm not standing down anything based on..." Mulvane stopped. Recalibrated. Tried a different angle. "You went in there alone, without authorization, with an animal that just injured a soldier, and you're telling me to stand down? I'm telling you the dog is not aggressive. He was trying to communicate something." She paused. "You should probably get your security team to look at the ventilation system in that room, specifically the grate on the east wall." Mulvane's expression went through about 4 distinct emotions in 2 seconds. Why? Because Coda was alerting on it. He's a recovery patient. Post-surgical. He's a trained military working dog, Emily said. Being in recovery doesn't turn that off. If anything, being stationary in a room for 4 days gives a dog like him a lot of time to notice things. Mulvane looked at her like he was deciding whether to be angry or take her seriously, and chose the path of least resistance, which was mild contempt. "Thank you for your input," he said, with the tone of someone filing input directly into a trash can. "We'll take it from here." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her medication round. She was charting at the nurse's station 40 minutes later when Dr. Victor Hale found her. Hale was Westbridge's chief of surgery, 53 years old, former military physician, the kind of man who had translated his service record into an authority that he wore like a second uniform. He was good at his job. Emily didn't dispute that. He was also precisely the sort of person who had never once in his professional life considered that someone quieter or younger or with a lower title might know something he didn't. Pulled up a chair, which surprised her. Hale didn't usually sit when he could stand over someone. "Sergeant Mulvane briefed me," he said. "Okay. He's concerned about your conduct. Going into a containment situation without clearance, handling a military asset without handler authorization." "I walked through a door," Emily said. "The dog stopped what he was doing and went still. I reported an observation to Sergeant Mulvane and came back to my work." Hale studied her. He had sharp eyes and he used them. "You have experience with working dogs?" She kept her expression neutral. "I grew up with dogs. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole story." "The SEAL team is coming in tomorrow for an assessment," Hale said. "Until then, Coda remains in secure recovery, and you are not to enter that unit without my authorization." "Is he going to be observed tonight? Properly?" "That's not your concern. It's my concern if he's alerting on something real and no one's taking it seriously." Hale leaned back slightly. "Emily," said her name like a punctuation mark, like he was finishing a sentence rather than beginning one. "You're a nurse. A good nurse. I've got no complaints about your clinical work. But what happened tonight was not a clinical situation, and your instinct to insert yourself into it was problematic." She looked at him. "You don't know what he was trying to say," she said. It was nearly word for word what she'd said to Mulvane. But the meaning was different now, quieter, more certain. Hale stood up. Get some rest. You've got a full shift tomorrow. He paused at the edge of her workspace. Stay away from the K9 suite. Emily watched him go. Then she turned back to her chart, and for exactly 30 seconds, she sat completely still. The ventilation grate, the replaced screw. The way Coda had looked at the wall, then at her, then at the wall again, not random agitation, not pain behavior, not the panicked reaction of an injured animal in an unfamiliar environment. Pattern behavior. Directed alerting. She'd seen it before. A long time ago, in a different facility, in a different part of the world. Under circumstances she had a federal obligation not to discuss with anyone who didn't share her clearance level. Pulled up Coda's intake file and read it again. Handler Petty Officer First Class Marcus Vane, SEAL Team Bravo, attached to Naval Special Warfare Group 3. Coda's operational specialty listed, because someone had pulled his classified summary for veterinary context, included narcotics detection, personnel tracking, and structural threat identification. Structural threat identification. Emily set down her pen. Structural threat identification meant the dog had been trained to detect modified environments, altered spaces, places where someone had changed something, installed something, hidden something that the original design didn't include. She looked at the clock. 2:14 a.m. She thought about the grate. She thought about what you'd put inside a ventilation system in a military medical facility if you wanted to hurt people, and you needed time to set it up, and you needed to be there, present, with access, to do it. 2:31 a.m. Emily made a decision that she knew was going to cost her something. She didn't go back to the K9 suite. She wasn't going to violate Hale's directive outright, not yet. But she pulled the facility blueprint from the engineering database, using her nurse access, which technically allowed her to view maintenance layouts for patient care areas. She found the K9 suite, found the east wall, traced the ventilation system. The Great Coda had been alerting on fed into a secondary duct that ran behind the east wing of the facility, a wing that included, among other things, the secure records room and the communications hub. Stared at that for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't done in 14 months at Westbridge. She accessed the secondary contact directory she had memorized, rather than stored, found a number, and sent a text from her personal phone to an unregistered line that connected to a person she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Coda's alerting on modified environment. East wall K9 suite. Duct connects to comms hub. Nobody's listening. Vane's handler. Call your people. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Then she went back to her medication round and finished it with steady hands, because whatever was coming, she needed to be standing in front of it, with a complete patient chart. The shift change happened at 6 a.m. Emily was supposed to leave. She didn't. She told the charge nurse she was finishing documentation, which was partially true, and went to the staff lounge to sit with bad coffee and her own thinking. By 6:40 the first indication came that something was moving. Sergeant Mulvane was back in the building in civilian clothes, which meant he'd left and come back. And the expression on his face was one she recognized from a particular kind of briefing, the face of someone who had been told they were wrong and was processing it badly. By 7:15, 2 vehicles she didn't recognize pulled into the rear facility lot. Emily stood at the staff lounge window and watched them. Black SUVs, government plates, no unit insignia. 4 people got out of the first vehicle, 2 from the second. They moved with a specific economy of motion that told her exactly who they were before she saw any identification. The SEAL assessment team. 12 hours early. She didn't know if it was her text. She suspected it was. She also suspected that whoever had responded to her text had pulled a thread that unraveled quickly, because these people didn't move like they were here for a routine evaluation. They moved like they were here for something specific. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Still a nurse? The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that places from your past are familiar, not warm, but known. Still a nurse, she said. Coda's handler is on site in 20 minutes. Command wants the K9 suite secured until he arrives. Can you make sure that happens without tipping anyone? Hale told me to stay out of the unit. Hale doesn't have the context. Does he need to be briefed? A pause. Not yet. Just make sure nobody else goes in there and nobody touches that grate. Understood. She paused. Is it what I think it is? Another pause, longer this time. Probably worse, the voice said, and ended the call. Emily pocketed her phone. She thought about Dr. Hale, who had told her she was just a nurse. She thought about Mulvane, who had filed her concern in a trash can. She thought about Coda, standing in the middle of that room at midnight, 80 pounds of disciplined, decorated, battle-tested animal, barking his head off at a wall because he knew something was wrong, and he had no other language for it. Put on her ID badge, straightened her scrubs. Then she walked toward the K9 suite with steady hands and a very specific plan, because the one thing 14 months of keeping her head down had not changed was this. When she knew something was wrong, she had never once been able to pretend she didn't. She was almost to the suite door when she heard footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful, the stride of someone who'd been looking for her. Turned. It was Mulvane. His expression had shifted from the contained contempt of last night into something harder to read, tighter, like a man holding a piece of information that didn't fit any category he already had. "Nurse Carter," he said. "Sergeant." He stopped 3 feet from her, looked at the door of the K9 suite, then back at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "The security team ran the east wall at 0530, he said. His voice was flat and careful. "The grate you mentioned." Emily waited. "There was a device," Mulvane said, "behind the secondary panel. A listening device and what preliminary assessment is calling a potential delivery mechanism. We don't have full analysis yet," but he stopped, worked his jaw. "We don't know how long it's been there." The hallway was quiet. "Is anyone else aware?" she asked. "Security chief and the overnight commander. And now the team that just arrived." His eyes stayed on her. Apparently somebody called. 12 hours ahead of schedule. Emily looked at him steadily. Mulvane was not a man who apologized easily. Probably not a man who apologized often at all. But she watched him work up to something, and whatever it was, it came out stiff and awkward and genuine, the way things do when someone's not used to them. "You said he was trying to say something," Mulvane said. "Yes, you were right," she nodded once. "Who are you?" Mulvane asked. Not hostile, actually asking. Emily looked at the door to the suite. Behind it, she could hear Coda moving, pacing. Probably working off residual adrenaline the way trained dogs did when they knew the alert had been received but hadn't seen the resolution yet. She thought about how to answer. She thought about 3 years of silence, of paperwork, marked things she couldn't repeat, of a version of herself she'd carefully folded away when she transitioned out and came to a place like Westbridge, where she could keep helping people without anyone knowing the particular shape her help had taken before. "The nurse," she said. But the way she said it, and the way Mulvane heard it, standing in a military facility hallway at 7 in the morning, with the knowledge that a dog had detected a threat that every trained human in the building had missed, neither of them believed it for a second. Inside the suite, Coda went still. Then he barked once, sharp and declarative, the way working dogs do when they've been confirmed. "Yes, you got it. Now move." Emily's hand was already on the door. She pushed the door open, and Coda was already moving toward her, not the frantic, wall-rattling charge from last night, but a controlled, purposeful approach, the kind that said, "You came back," rather than "help me." Pressed his nose briefly against her knee, then stepped back and sat. Perfect sit, alert posture, eyes on her face. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I know." She crouched beside him and checked his bandage, by habit still clean. No seepage, the surgical site holding well, and he let her do it, the way he'd let her do everything since he came in. Patience that felt less like submission and more like professional courtesy. Like he understood she was doing her job and respected it. The room felt different in the early morning light. Smaller somehow. The east wall where the grate sat looked completely ordinary gray concrete, standard hospital construction. Nothing that would make a person look twice. Emily looked at it anyway. The security team had been in here. They'd have taken photographs, extracted whatever they found, replaced the grate cover so as not to tip anyone off. She could see the faint scuff marks near the baseboard where knees had been. She heard voices in the hallway. The SEAL team moving fast. Stood up, gave Coda one more check, and walked back out before anyone could make an issue of her being there. The hallway had transformed in the 40 minutes since she'd last walked it. Mulvane was coordinating something near the nurses' station with 2 of the people from the black SUVs, a man and a woman, both in civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes do when the person underneath is used to wearing something with more structure. The woman had a tablet and was talking quietly into an earpiece. The man was studying a facility map, his finger tracing a line Emily recognized as the ventilation corridor. Hale appeared from the direction of his office. He hadn't slept, his suit was the same one from last night, and his face had the particular grayness of a man who'd been awake for something unpleasant. He saw Emily. His expression did something complicated. "Told you to stay out of that unit," he said, not aggressive. "Almost tired, you did," she agreed, "and you went back in anyway." The dog needed to know someone was maintaining continuity of care. Post-surgical animals in high-stress environments benefit from familiar contact. Spikes in cortisol can compromise wound healing. She said it evenly. Clinically. Every word was accurate, and none of it was the real reason. Hale looked at her for a long moment. He was trying to categorize her and having trouble. She could tell she'd watched him do it last night, and he still hadn't landed anywhere satisfying. Going to be a briefing in 20 minutes, he said finally. Small group security personnel and the assessment team. He paused. I'm told you should be there. Told by who? He pressed his lips together. Team lead. Emily nodded. She didn't make him say more than that. The briefing room was a repurposed conference space on the second floor, 8 chairs, around a rectangular table, a screen at one end currently displaying a schematic of the facility's ventilation system, the east wing highlighted in yellow. The SEAL assessment team occupied one side of the table, 3 men and the woman Emily had seen in the hallway, plus one additional person who'd come in separately and whom Emily recognized with a precision that she kept entirely off her face. Marcus Vane, Coda's handler. He was younger than she'd imagined from his file, maybe 30, with a kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from sustained discipline, from learning to hold everything inside because the work requires it. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that was healing, maybe 10 days old. He sat with his hands flat on the table and watched everyone else in the room with a careful, measuring attention. He looked at Emily when she walked in and something shifted in his expression, not recognition, but recalibration. Like a number that didn't fit a pattern until you looked at it differently. Team lead was a woman named Driscoll. She didn't give a first name or a rank, just Driscoll, and she ran the room the way Emily imagined she ran everything direct. No commentary, no performance. What we found in the K9 Suite East Wall, Driscoll began, without preamble, as a dual-function device. Audio surveillance component and a secondary unit that preliminary analysis indicates could disperse a chemical agent through the ventilation system. We don't have full characterization yet. That's with our technical team now. But the design is sophisticated and the installation is recent. Within the last 72 hours, the room absorbed this. Hale, to his credit, didn't make a sound. The detection came from the K9 asset, Driscoll continued. Coda began alerting at approximately 2,300 hours last night. By then, the device had already been in place long enough for him to establish certainty. He was alerting for hours before we understood what was happening, Mulvane said. He was looking at the table when he said it. Yes, Driscoll said, and didn't elaborate, which was its own kind of indictment. Vane spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Emily expected. Who responded to the alert? A beat of silence. Mulvane gestured toward Emily without looking at her directly. Nurse Carter. She recognized what he was doing and identified the target location. Every person at the table looked at Emily. You have K9 handling experience? Vane asked. Some, Emily said. It was the second time in 24 hours she'd given an answer that was accurate and insufficient. And she could feel Vane filing it the same way Mulvane had filed it as a data point that didn't yet have a column. The ventilation system, Driscoll said, redirecting. We're isolating the segment that connects to the communications hub and the secure records room. Those 2 areas are being treated as potentially compromised until we complete the sweep. She looked at Hale. Staff need to be told there's a maintenance issue requiring temporary access restrictions. Nothing more. Hale nodded. He was pale. We're also running a personnel review, Driscoll continued. The installation of a device like this requires physical access and technical knowledge. It wasn't done by someone who wandered in from outside. She let that land. It was done by someone with routine access to this facility. Temperature in the room dropped a few degrees, though the HVAC was running fine. Someone on staff, Hale said. Someone on staff, Driscoll confirmed. The briefing broke up 20 minutes later with no resolution and a list of instructions nobody was entirely happy with. Emily was heading for the stairwell when Vane fell into step beside her. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought maybe he was just going the same direction. Then he said, You knew he wasn't aggressive. Yes. Most people would have waited for the handler, especially with a dog they've never worked with. Most people don't know what structural alerting looks like. She kept walking. He was pointing at the wall. Not performing threat behavior, not defending space, pointing. Vane was quiet again. They reached the stairwell, and Emily pushed through the door. Where'd you do your training? He asked. She stopped on the landing, turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the careful eyes she'd noticed in the briefing room. Not suspicious curious in the way people are when they're trying to fit a piece into a picture they already have the outline of. I'm not cleared to discuss my training history with you, she said. It was the most accurate thing she'd said all morning. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or something close to it. Kota doesn't trust easily, he said. Some weeks usually, with new handlers. Post-surgery, he's protective of himself, of the space. Vane paused. He let you in last night. He needed someone to listen. Yeah. Vane looked at her for a moment longer. He did. He held the stairwell door open for her. It was a small thing. But it was different from the way the door had been held for her yesterday, when she was just the nurse who changed the dressings. By 10 in the morning, the shift she was supposed to have left hours ago had officially become a second consecutive double, and Emily's body was beginning to register complaints. Her lower back had started its familiar protest around hour 16, the kind of deep ache that lived between the shoulder blades and expanded downward when you'd been on your feet too long. She'd grabbed actual food, a real meal from the cafeteria, eggs and toast that were only slightly ruined by the steam table, and eaten it standing at a counter, because every chair in the break room was occupied by people having conversations she didn't want to interrupt. The ward was busy in the way it always was mid-morning, and she threw herself into it because that was the one thing she could do cleanly. The patients in front of her, the charts that needed finishing, the medications that needed to be right. There was a post-op captain recovering from knee reconstruction who kept trying to get out of bed before his drain was clear. There was a young specialist, 19 years old, and terrified in the specific way people are, when pain is worse than they expected, and nobody warned them, who needed more time than Emily technically had, but got it anyway. There was paperwork. There was always paperwork. She was 3 hours into the ward when Dr. Hale found her again. He waited until she'd finished what she was doing, with the young specialist waited at the door, which was not his usual style, and then walked with her to the corridor. Security review is expanding, he said. Driscoll's team is pulling access logs for the last 2 weeks. They're looking at everyone. That's thorough. It means interviews. For all staff. He paused. Including you, Emily looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything, Hale said, and the way he said it made her suspect. He'd had to talk himself into that position. Driscoll's process, standard procedure, I understand. He nodded. He started to go, then stopped. Turned back. This was becoming a pattern with him. She'd noticed the thing he said first was never quite the thing he meant, and the real thing came out after he'd had a step to reconsider. You knew last night, he said, before anyone else. I had an observation. Mulvane made the call to check. But you told him where to look. She met his eyes and waited. I owe you an acknowledgement, Hale said. I dismissed what you said. I shouldn't have. He delivered it like a man who was constitutionally opposed to the activity, but understood it was necessary. I'll do better. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was as close as Hale was probably capable of in a hallway at 10:30 in the morning after a night of consecutive bad news. Thank you, she said, and meant it without making it a victory. Her interview with Driscoll's team was at 2 o'clock, in the same conference room from the morning briefing. 2 people this time, the woman with the tablet, whose name turned out to be Specialist Okafor, and a man who introduced himself only as with Federal Security Assessment and whose name Emily didn't push for. The interview was methodical. Her credentials, her hire date, her background as submitted to Westbridge HR. She'd listed her prior experience as trauma nursing at 2 civilian hospitals and a general notation of prior military medical support that covered what it needed to cover. They asked about her movements the previous 3 days. They asked about anyone she'd seen in the East Wing who didn't have a clear reason to be there. They asked about her familiarity with the K9 asset. They were careful, professional, and looking for something that Emily was fairly certain they weren't going to find in her file. Prior military experience, Okafor said. Can you elaborate? Documented in my service record, Emily said, which requires a specific clearance to access. Okafor made a note. Prized. And your K9 handling background? Same answer. The federal man leaned forward slightly. Nurse Carter, we're not trying to create problems for you. We're trying to understand how you identified the alert behavior when 4 trained soldiers couldn't. Emily looked at him steadily. I spent time around working dogs in a context I'm not authorized to discuss. What I can tell you is that Kota's behavior was textbook structural alerting. I recognized it. I acted on it, and I reported what I found to the senior officer present. She paused. That's all I can give you. He held her gaze for a moment. That's all we need, he said, and she believed him. What she didn't know, while she was sitting in that interview, was that 17 floors below her clearance level, someone was having a much more uncomfortable conversation. She found out about it later, in pieces, the way you find things out in facilities like Westbridge, not through announcement, but through the particular shift in atmosphere that happens when a building changes pressure. The way the nurses at the station went quieter around 3 o'clock. The way Mulvane's appeared in the corridor at 3, 15, with his jaw set and his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of a man receiving instructions he didn't like. The way Hale disappeared into his office at 3:30 and didn't come out. By 4 o'clock, Emily knew something had happened. She just didn't know what. She found out at 4:22 when Vane appeared in the doorway of the ward supply room where she was restocking IV supplies because she needed something to do with her hands. They found a second device, he said. Emily's hands stopped moving. Communications hub, behind the secondary relay panel. His voice was controlled, but something in it had gone tight. It's more sophisticated than the first one. Already active. Active, she repeated. Transmitting, has been transmitting. He paused. At least 5 days. She counted backward in her head. 5 days ago. 2 days before Coda came in. Someone brought him in injured, she said slowly. Vane's expression confirmed it before he spoke. The field report said he caught the laceration on a fence during a training exercise. Routine injury. He stopped, swallowed something. We're now questioning whether the injury was incidental. Emily set down the IV bag she was holding. Someone wanted him out of the field, she said. Someone wanted him in this building, Vane said. In a recovery unit where he'd be contained. Where his alerting behavior could be attributed to post-surgical stress. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before, a crack in the professional composure. Small but real. If he'd been in the field when the second device went active, he'd have identified it within hours. Instead, he was here, and the plan was for everyone to think he'd gone dangerous, so they'd extract him entirely. The supply room felt very small. The device in the comms hub, Emily said carefully. What's it transmitting? That's what they're working on. Vane leaned against the doorframe, looked at the ceiling for a second, just a second, and then back at her. Everything that moves through that hub. Schedules. Personnel files, operation timelines, he let that sit. Whoever planted it has had 5 days of everything. Emily thought about the access logs Driscoll's team was pulling. Thought about who'd had access to the comms hub over the last 2 weeks. Thought about the particular kind of person who could move through a facility like Westbridge without anyone tracking their presence too closely. Who knew Coda was being brought in, she asked. That's the question, Vane said. It was also the answer, Emily realized. Or the beginning of one. She looked at the stack of IV bags in front of her. She'd been putting them in order by volume, by type, by expiration date. Thematic. The same way she'd been approaching this building since last night, putting things in order, trying to find the pattern underneath the noise. The injuries, she said, in the 72 hours before Coda came in. Were any of them unusual? Vane frowned. How do you mean? New admissions. Anything that gave someone a reason to be in the East Wing, specifically, who wouldn't normally be there. Vane was quiet for a moment, thinking. There was a maintenance request. Water pressure issue in the East Wing utility corridor. 2 days before Coda's intake. Was it resolved? I'd have to check. Check, Emily said. He looked at her. The same recalibration she'd seen in the stairwell that morning. The look of a man adjusting a number that doesn't fit. Who are you? He said. Same question as Mulvane. Different weight. I'm the nurse who's been here long enough to know this building, she said. Go check the maintenance log. He went. She finished restocking the supply room and went back to the ward and did her job for 2 more hours. Because the patients didn't stop needing care, because the building was compromised. And if she let herself stop moving, she was going to have to sit with the full weight of what 5 days of transmitted intelligence meant for people whose names she probably knew from the personnel files she helped maintain. 6:15, her phone buzzed. Same unknown number as the night before. Maintenance request was fraudulent. Submitted under credentials that were stolen from a staff member on leave. Person who submitted it had building access. Driscoll's team is 3 hours from a name. Emily read it twice. Then she typed, does Vane know? Response came in under a minute, he will. But there's a problem. The person they're looking at has already been tipped. He knows the net is closing. She stood very still in the middle of the corridor. Still in the building, she typed. 3 dots. Then yes. Emily looked up and down the corridor. Normal foot traffic. Staff moving between wards. The quiet, controlled rhythm of a medical facility in early evening. Nothing that looked wrong. Nothing that looked like a man who knew investigators were 3 hours from his name and had decided to use those 3 hours. Started walking. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She was going toward Coda, because that was the only honest answer, because Coda had been right about everything so far, and the instinct that told her the dog in a recovery unit was the sharpest mind in this facility had not changed. She was halfway to the K9 suite when she rounded a corner and stopped. Standing in front of the suite door, with his hand on the handle and his back to her, was a man she recognized. She'd seen him in briefings, passed him in hallways. Exchange professional nods the way you do with people you see every day, without ever having a real conversation. He had the rank and the record and the kind of institutional trust that takes years to build, and he had used all of it to stand in exactly this corridor, in front of exactly this door, at exactly this moment. He heard her, turned. They looked at each other for 2 full seconds, the length of time it takes a situation to shift from ambiguous to something else entirely. His hand was still on the door handle. Inside the suite, Coda began to bark. His name was Colonel Reed Harlan. That was the thing Emily's mind snagged on in those 2 seconds, not the threat calculus, not the distance between them, not the fact that his hand was still on the door handle, but his name. Because she'd passed him in 3 briefings and 2 hallways, and never once had reason to think about him past the polite professional nod. Reed Harlan, Facility Liaison Officer, 22 years of service. Commendations she'd seen framed in the administrative corridor, the kind of institutional wallpaper that becomes invisible precisely because it's everywhere. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and Coda was barking with the sustained, certain rhythm of an animal that had been right about everything from the beginning. Harlan's hand came off the door handle. "Nurse Carter," he said. His voice was completely steady, which told her more than if it had shaken. "Colonel." The corridor was empty in both directions. That was the thing about 6:15 on a weekday in a military medical facility. The shift overlap created a gap, 20 minutes where traffic thinned while staff transitioned. She'd known that without thinking about it, the way you know the rhythms of a place after 14 months, and she understood now that Harlan had known it too. "You're working late," he said. "Double shift." She kept her voice even, her hands loose at her sides. "You?" Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation. She could see him doing it, assessing what she knew, what she'd seen, whether the situation was still manageable. "Checking on the K9 asset," he said. "Given the security situation." "Right," she said. They both knew that was not what was happening. Emily's phone was in her left scrub's pocket. She needed 30 seconds, and she needed him not to move for those 30 seconds. She also needed to be honest with herself that she was alone in a corridor with a man who had spent 5 days transmitting classified intelligence to unknown parties, and who was standing in front of the room where the only witness to his activity was an 80-pound dog. "I was actually just going to check on him myself," she said. She took 1 step forward, measured, post-surgical check. "Cortisol's been elevated. The security activity today hasn't helped." Harlan didn't move away from the door, but he didn't move toward her either. "Can wait," he said. "No need." Another step. Her hand went to her ID badge on her left chest, a habit, the gesture nurses made when entering secured spaces, and her other hand moved naturally toward her pocket. "I'll just be a minute." Her fingers found her phone. Harlan saw the movement. The calculation behind his eyes resolved into something harder, and he took 1 step away from the door, not backing down. Repositioning, and his right hand moved toward his side in the instinctive way of a soldier reaching for something that wasn't there, because he was in a medical facility, and he wasn't carrying. Neither was she. What she had was a phone and 14 months of knowing this building, and the specific knowledge that the monitoring station for the K9 suite had a secondary audio feed that fed directly to the facility security desk. She hit the emergency nurse call button on her badge. Lanyard, a small red toggle most staff forgot was there, designed for patient threat situations. Wired to the station desk and the security office simultaneously, and held it for 3 full seconds. Harlan heard the faint electronic click. "Don't," he said. "Already done," she said. What happened next took 11 minutes and felt like considerably longer. Harlan didn't run. That was the thing that surprised her. Most she'd half expected him to break for the stairwell, but he didn't. Stood in the corridor and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, something between resignation and fury that hadn't decided yet which one it was going to commit to. "You don't know what you're involved in," he said. "I know what Coda was trying to tell us," she said. "It's enough." The dog. He said it with a contempt that was thin over something else, panic maybe, or genuine disbelief that this was how it had unraveled. Recovery dog. A working dog doing his job. She kept her eyes on him. Kept distance between them. While everyone in this building was trying to figure out how to shut him up. Security arrived at 6. 24-2 officers from the desk, and behind them, Driscoll moving fast with Okafor and the federal man whose name Emily still didn't know. They came from both ends of the corridor at the same time, which meant someone had already been moving before her badge signal, which meant Driscoll's 3 hours had compressed into something shorter. Harlan looked at the people coming from both directions, looked at Emily, looked at the door to the K9 suite. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The federal man had zip cuffs. He used them with the efficiency of someone who'd done it many times. Harlan's hands went behind his back, and he was moved down the corridor, and Emily stood where she was and watched him go. And the thing she felt was not satisfaction or relief, but a complicated, heavy steadiness, the feeling of having carried something a long distance and finally being allowed to set it down. Driscoll stopped in front of her. "You called it in," Driscoll said. "I hit the nurse call. I didn't know if anyone would be monitoring. We'd already issued a quiet alert to security. Your signal confirmed his location." Driscoll looked at her for a moment in the way she'd looked at her all day, direct, measuring, not unfriendly. "You want to tell me how you knew to come to this corridor?" He knew the security gap. 6:15, staff transition. Emily gestured toward the suite door. "He came for the dog." "Why the dog?" "Because Coda's the only one who can't be questioned, reassigned, or intimidated," Emily said. "He's evidence. Harlan needed him gone before the net closed." Driscoll absorbed this. "You put yourself between a compromised officer and a military asset with no weapon and no backup," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a compliment yet. "I had a nurse call button," Emily said, "and 14 months of building schematics." Something shifted in Driscoll's expression. Not quite a smile. "I need you in the debrief room in 30 minutes, she said. "Don't go anywhere." Emily looked at the suite door. "Can someone stay with Coda? He's been through a lot today." Driscoll looked at the door, then back at her. "I'll have Vane sent up." Debrief took 2 hours. It was thorough in a way that made the morning interview feel like a casual conversation. Driscoll ran it with 3 other people. Emily hadn't met 2 of whom had the particular quality of federal law enforcement that she recognized less from badges and more from the specific way they phrased questions, always slightly ahead of where the answers were, always leaving space for a person to extend further than they meant to. Emily had been on the other side of that kind of questioning before. She knew the shape of it. She told them what she'd observed. Corridor. Harlan's position. The hand movement toward his side. Calculation in his expression. She was precise and chronological. And when she reached the edges of things she wasn't cleared, to explain why she'd recognized working dog alert behavior, why she knew to trace the ventilation system, why she'd contacted an unregistered number at 2:31 in the morning, she said clearly and without apology that those answers required a clearance level she wasn't sure anyone in the room possessed. Driscoll didn't push. She noted it and moved on, which told Emily that Driscoll had already made calls she wasn't advertising. By 9 o'clock, Emily knew the broad shape of what Harlan had done, pieced together from the questions that surrounded it. The fraudulent maintenance request, the device installation during the window it created, the deliberate timing of Coda's transfer. The injury had been real, but the choice to route the animal to Westbridge rather than the closer facility at Donner Air Base had gone through Harlan's office, where he'd had authority over logistics coordination, created the conditions. He'd put the dog in a box. He'd watched the alert escalate and had been in the room when Mulvane called for extraction and had said nothing because extraction was exactly what he needed. 5 days of transmitted data. The federal man told her, at the end, that the receiving endpoint was offshore and that the content included operational timelines for 2 active missions whose personnel were now being notified of the compromise. People were in danger, not hypothetically, actually specifically in danger, because a man with 22 years of institutional trust had decided that trust had a different value than the one everyone else assigned to it. Emily sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with bad outcomes in clinical work, not flinching away, not making it smaller than it was, just holding the full weight of it and staying upright anyway, because falling apart didn't fix anything. It was 9:47 when she finally got back to the K9 suite. Vane was there, as promised, sitting on the floor, which she hadn't expected, back against the wall beside Coda's kennel with the door open, and Coda lying half in and half out of it, his head on Vane's knee. They both looked up when she came in. Vane looked exhausted. Coda's tail moved once, deliberate, the controlled version of a greeting from a dog who conserved his energy. "Hey," Vane said. "Hey." She crouched and checked the surgical site by reflex. Still clean. She'd need to change the dressing in the morning, but tonight it could wait. "How's he doing?" "Better than me," Vane said honestly. She sat on the floor on the other side of the kennel. It was an odd position for a professional interaction, the 3 of them on the floor of a medical suite at 10 o'clock at night. A handler and a nurse bracketing a dog who had blown the whole thing open, but odd didn't bother her. She'd sat in stranger places under worse circumstances. "Driscoll told me what you did in the corridor," Vane said. "I hit a button. You put yourself in front of him. He wasn't armed. You didn't know that." Emily looked at Coda, who had closed his eyes in the particular way that meant he was resting, but not fully asleep, still monitoring, still present, still working even when he looked like he wasn't. I know, she said. Calculated it. Vane was quiet for a moment. What's your real background? He asked. It was the third time someone had asked her a version of that question, and this time it had a different quality, not suspicious, not investigating, just one person asking another person a real question in a room where the professional distance had been compressed by a very long day. She looked at the wall where the grate was. The replacement cover was there, the real device gone to whatever technical facility was now dissecting it. Spent 4 years attached to a special operations medical unit, she said. K9 integration was part of 2 of those deployments. Was a battlefield medic. She paused. When I transitioned out, I qualified as a civilian trauma nurse because I needed something that wasn't classified, that I could do without carrying the weight of everything else. She looked at Coda. I'm good at the nursing. I like it. That's not a cover story. But you're not just a nurse, Vane said. I'm both things, she said. People have trouble with that. Vane scratched behind Coda's ear. The dog's tail moved again without him opening his eyes. Driscoll's going to want your full file, he said. I know. Is that a problem? It's complicated. She stood up. But no, not anymore. The full weight of what Harlan had transmitted didn't hit the facility until the following morning, and when it did, it hit hard. Emily was back on shift. She'd gone home for 6 hours, which was not enough, but was what she had, when the facility went into a modified security posture at 700. Additional personnel at entry points. Restricted movement between wings. Kind of low-profile, high-tension lockdown that looked like maintenance if you didn't know what you were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. The 2 missions whose timelines had been compromised were being rerouted. Personnel were being notified and repositioned. The specifics were above her clearance, but the urgency wasn't. She could read it in the way Driscoll's team moved through the building, in the shortened exchanges at the security desk, in the way Mulvane looked every time he passed her in the hallway. Like a man holding a grenade he'd already committed to catching. By 9 o'clock, Hale called her into his office. She expected another conversation about conduct. What she got was different. He was standing when she came in. Didn't sit. Gestured to a chair and then stood behind his desk with his hands in his pockets, which on Hale was the equivalent of someone else pacing. Driscoll briefed me this morning, he said, on your background. Emily sat. Not the classified elements, he added quickly. The broad outline. That you came out of special operations medical work. Your K9 experience was substantive. He pressed his lips together. That you weren't operating on luck or instinct when you identified the alert behavior. No, she said. I owe you more than an acknowledgement, Hale said. He said it like it cost him, which she respected. I actively restricted your access. I dismissed your assessment. If you'd complied with my directive, if you'd stayed out of the suite last night. You didn't have the information to make a different call, Emily said. I wasn't forthcoming with it. You weren't cleared to be. No. He sat down, looked at his desk. I'm a surgeon. I operate on evidence. When you walked into that room, I didn't have evidence that you were anything other than a nurse making a judgment call above her training. He looked up. I should have asked better questions instead of assuming I already knew the answer. It was the most self-aware thing she'd heard him say in 14 months, and she thought that this was probably what a real apology looked like, from a man like Hale, not comfortable, not graceful, but honest. I accept that, she said. He nodded. Then, Driscoll's team wants your cooperation in completing the formal investigation record. They need your account of the device identification, the corridor encounter, the full sequence. He paused. Some of it will require accessing records that are currently sealed. Your service records. I know, she said. Are you comfortable with that? She thought about the sealed file, the years of work she'd packed into it and zippered shut when she left. The version of herself she'd folded away in a drawer, because she'd needed to be something that was just one thing. For a while, just a nurse, just the person with the medication cart and the patient charts, without the weight of everything that came before. She looked at Hale's desk and thought about Coda in that room at midnight, pointing at the wall with everything he had, barking until someone listened. Yes, she said. I'm comfortable. The formal investigation moved fast, the way federal investigations do when the evidence is already assembled and the only remaining work is documentation and consequence. Harlan was transferred to federal custody at 1400 hours that afternoon, moved out of the facility in a vehicle with no insignia, which Emily saw from a second-floor window by accident, not by intention. He was in the back seat behind tinted glass, and she couldn't see his face. She wasn't sure she needed to. What Driscoll's team had reconstructed, piece by piece, was a timeline that went back 8 months. Harlan hadn't acted alone. There was a contact offshore, a relationship that had begun as financial and become operational, but he'd been the entry point. He'd had the access and the credibility and the patience to do it slowly, carefully, in ways that didn't draw attention precisely because he was the kind of person nobody thought to look at twice. The listening device in the K9 suite had been secondary. Insurance, maybe, or an additional data stream. The primary device in the comms hub was the real operation. What he hadn't accounted for was a dog with a laceration on his rear leg who'd spent 4 days in a quiet room with nothing to do but pay attention. The irony of that wasn't lost on Driscoll, who said it in exactly those terms during the afternoon briefing that Emily was, for the first time, explicitly included in. Not as a witness, as a participant. She sat at the table where 24 hours ago she'd been a name on a personnel list and tried not to make anything of the difference. Tried and didn't entirely succeed because she was human and she'd spent 14 months being professionally invisible, and it was difficult not to notice when that changed. Vane was across the table. He caught her eye once and gave her a small, precise nod, not congratulatory, more like acknowledgement. Like one professional recognizing another across a space where they'd both been doing their jobs and the jobs had intersected in a way that mattered. She nodded back. The briefing broke at 1700 hours, and Emily went back to the ward because the patients still needed their evening medications, and nobody had arranged coverage for the shift she was technically still supposed to be working. She did it the way she always did, methodically, room by room, checking charts, checking people, asking the right questions, and listening to the answers. The young specialist with the knee surgery was doing better. He'd managed 2 laps of the ward with a PT support, and he was scared and proud in equal measure, the way people are when they've done something hard and aren't sure it counts yet. She told him it counted. He looked like he needed to hear it. By 7 o'clock, the ward had settled into its evening rhythm, and Emily was at the nurse's station finishing her charting when her phone buzzed. The unknown number again. Your file has been requested by Naval Special Warfare Command. Driscoll initiated it this afternoon. You'll be contacted for a formal review in the next 48 hours. Stared at that for a moment. What kind of review? She typed. The response took longer this time. Almost 4 minutes, which on that line meant someone was thinking carefully about what to say. Kind that asks whether you're wasted where you are. Emily read it twice, set her phone face down on the desk. She looked at the ward in front of her, the rooms with their soft lighting, the sounds of a medical floor in the evening, the particular mix of machines and footsteps, and muffled conversation that she'd absorbed so completely over 14 months it had become the texture of her days. Patient in room 4 who needed his dressing changed. The chart she still had 3 notes to finish. The young specialist who'd asked her this afternoon, with the earnestness of someone who wasn't sure of the answer, does it get easier? She'd told him yes, because it did, because that was true, because the honest answer wasn't always the complicated one. Picked up her phone and typed, I know where I am. Sent it. Put the phone in her pocket. She was halfway to room 4 when she heard it, not loud, not dramatic, just a sound she knew from the K9 suite 3 floors up, carrying through the building's ventilation, in the way sounds dead in the quiet of evening. Coda barking, not the frantic cascade of last night, not the sustained alert rhythm she'd heard when he was pointing at the wall. This was different, 2 short barks, then silence, then one more. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in a different building, in a different part of the world, from a different dog, years ago. It was the sound working dogs make when they want you to know they've found something, and they're not alarmed about it, and they're waiting for you to come see. Stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she changed direction. K9 suite was quiet when she pushed the door open. Vane was gone. The room was dim, just the low night-level lighting. And Coda was standing in the middle of the floor, not in his kennel, not by the east wall, not pointing at anything. He was looking at her. Just looking. Tail making the controlled, deliberate movement she'd already learned to read as something other than enthusiasm. He walked to her, put his nose against her palm for 2 seconds. Exactly 2, the same as the first night, and then stepped back. Sat, looked at her. Emily crouched, looked at him. What, she said quietly. Coda tilted his head. She checked his dressing by reflex, still clean, no seepage. The surgical site looked good. Pressed gently along the muscle above the suture line, and he didn't flinch, which was a good sign. Another day, maybe 2, and he'd be ready for supervised weight-bearing. She was about to stand when she noticed his eyes weren't on her face. They were tracking past her, toward the door she'd come in through, and in the same instant she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the normal rhythm of hospital staff. Quicker in 2 sets. Stood, the door opened. Driscoll came in first, and behind her was a person Emily had not expected, a man in service dress with the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command, someone who did not make unannounced visits to regional medical facilities for routine reasons. He looked at Emily standing in the middle of the K9's suite at 7:15 in the evening, and then he looked at Coda sitting precisely beside her, and something moved across his expression that she couldn't immediately name. "Nurse Carter," he said. "Admiral," she said, because that was what the insignia said. "Rear Admiral, 1 star, the kind of rank that didn't travel 40 miles outside of Carlin, Nevada, without a specific purpose." Driscoll closed the door. The Admiral looked at Coda, who had not moved from his position at Emily's side. "He trusts you," the Admiral said. "He trusts himself," Emily said. "I just listened." The Admiral reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a sealed envelope, standard Manila, military issue, her name typed on the front with a classification header that she hadn't seen in 3 years, and that meant the contents could not be discussed in any room that didn't meet specific security criteria. He held it out. Emily looked at it, looked at him. "What is this?" she asked, though something in her chest had already begun to understand. "Open it," he said. She took the envelope. Her name was on the front in block letters, Carter, Emily R. Below it, the classification header. Below that, a reference number. She didn't recognize a new file, not her old one. She broke the seal. Inside was a single page. She read it once, then read it again, because the first reading didn't fully resolve into meaning. When she looked up, the Admiral was watching her with the expression of a man who already knew what the page said and was waiting to see what she did with it. Coda pressed his shoulder against her knee. She looked down at him. He was watching her with the steady, unblinking focus he'd had since the first night, the posture of a dog who had been trying to say something for a very long time and was finally in a room where someone could hear it. "This is a reinstatement offer," she said. "Yes," the Admiral said. "To what unit?" he told her. The room was very quiet for a moment. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the facility, a door closed. Emily stood in the dim light of the K9 suite, holding a piece of paper that represented a version of herself she'd folded away and zipped shut, and told herself she'd left behind. And the thing that surprised her most was that her hands were completely steady. "I need 48 hours, she said. "You have them," the Admiral said. He nodded to Driscoll. They moved toward the door. "Admiral," Emily said. He stopped. "The people whose operational timelines were compromised," she said. 2 missions. She paused. "Are they going to be okay?" He held her gaze for a moment. "That depends," he said, "on some decisions that are still being made." He left. Driscoll held the door for a moment, looked back at Emily with the direct, measuring expression she'd worn since the morning. 48 hours, Driscoll said. "Don't waste them." The door closed. Emily stood in the K9 suite with a sealed military document in one hand and Coda's solid presence against her knee, and for the first time since midnight 2 days ago, she let herself be completely still. Not the stillness of someone holding themselves together. The other kind. The kind that comes after. Coda looked up at her. She looked down at him. "I know," she said. She folded the document, put it in her scrub's pocket. Then she pulled out her phone and opened a message thread and stared at the cursor for a long time. Because the message she needed to send was to someone she hadn't contacted in 3 years until last night, and what she needed to say wasn't tactical or operational or any of the clean, clear-edged things she was good at. Started typing. She was 4 words in when a second envelope slid under the door. Not slid pushed. Deliberately. Intentionally. By someone who was now walking quickly away from the other side, because she could hear the footsteps retreating down the corridor. Coda's head came up, his ears went forward. He looked at the envelope. Then at Emily. Then at the door. And barked once, sharp and certain, the way he did when something important had just changed. Emily stared at the envelope on the floor for exactly 1 second before she moved. Not toward it. Away from the door, she put her back against the east wall, the wall where the grate had been, and she listened. The footsteps she'd heard were already fading. Not running, walking with deliberate speed, the kind of pace that says I was never here rather than I'm fleeing. Counted the sound until it disappeared. 12 seconds. Whoever had pushed it had turned right at the corridor junction, which led toward the administrative wing and the secretary stairwell. Coda hadn't moved from his alert position, was watching the door with the focused, forward-weighted posture of a dog tracking something that was no longer visible. "I know," Emily said again. She picked up the envelope. No classification header this time. No typed label. Just her name, handwritten in block letters. The pen pressed hard enough that she could feel the impression through the paper. The handwriting was deliberate, but not careful someone writing fast, trying to write slowly and not entirely succeeding. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. She unfolded it. It was a personnel access log. Printed, not photographed. Someone had sent this to a printer and pulled it themselves, which meant they had physical access to the security system and had used it in the last hour, since the facility was still in modified lockdown and standard print access had been suspended. The header read Westbridge MMCF internal access last 30 days, and then below it, a list of room entries and exits by credential number. Someone had highlighted in yellow marker 8 entries. All 8 were to the same room, the pharmaceutical storage annex on sublevel 1, the secure medication vault that required both a credential scan and a supervisor cosign for access. The entries were spaced irregularly over 26 days. Credential number was printed clearly at the top. It wasn't Harlan's number. Emily looked at it for a moment. Then she turned the page over. On the back, in the same hard-pressed block letters, "Check what's missing." She looked at Coda. He was still watching the door. She folded the page, put it in her pocket with the Admiral's envelope, and pulled out her phone. The pharmaceutical annex was 4 floors down and required her to go through 2 security checkpoints that were tonight actually manned. She flashed her ID at both of them, and neither guard stopped her because she was a nurse, and the medication vault was theoretically within her access zone, even during modified lockdown, because patient care didn't stop for security postures, and someone had to be able to get to controlled substances in an emergency. She logged her access at the desk, outside the vault her credential number, timestamp stated purpose, and went in. The annex was cool and precisely organized, the way pharmaceutical storage always was in military facilities. Alphabetical, categorical, tracked by both weight and count, with a secondary system that reconciled the 2 numbers every 12 hours. She'd been in here dozens of times. She knew the layout. She went to the controlled substance section and started reading labels. Took her 6 minutes to find it. Potassium chloride. Count was short by 14 units. Not a large number. Not the kind of deficit that would trigger an immediate system flag in a facility this size during a period of elevated patient volume, but enough. 14 units of KCl in concentrated form, missing from a vault that was supposed to reconcile perfectly. She stood in front of the empty spaces on the shelf and thought about what you could do with 14 units of concentrated potassium chloride if you had access to a medical facility and you wanted to hurt someone in a way that looked like a cardiac event. The ventilation devices suddenly felt less like the primary threat. She photographed the shelf with her phone, documenting the lot numbers of the adjacent units, the empty spaces, the count label. Then she went back to the access log, the paper in her pocket, and counted 8 access events. Credential number at the top of the log. She needed to know whose number that was. She went back upstairs. The credential system cross-reference was not something she had access to from a standard nursing terminal. The charge desk in the administrative wing ran on a slightly elevated permission level that she knew about because she'd covered 3 shifts up there 6 months ago when they were short-staffed, and during those shifts she'd needed to look up personnel credentials for medication authorization purposes, and she had not forgotten how. The administrative wing was quiet at 8 p.m. One person at the desk, a young admin corporal named Waits, who she recognized from previous interactions, and who looked up when she came in with the expression of someone working hard not to look like they were having a bad night. "Hey," Emily said. "Sorry to bother you. I need a credential cross-reference for a pharmaceutical access audit. There's a count discrepancy in the annex, and I need to verify authorization." Frowned. During lockdown, all non-essential access requests are supposed to go through security. "I know. I've already flagged the count issue upward." She kept her voice even, professional. The tone of a tired nurse doing paperwork, rather than a person with an envelope from an admiral in her pocket. "I just need the name attached to a credential number, so I can include it in the audit report." 2 seconds. Waits looked at her, looked at the terminal. The calculation she watched him perform was familiar protocol versus inconvenience. Rules versus the specific weight of someone standing in front of you being reasonably human about a reasonable request. Turned to the terminal. "Give me the number." She read it off. He typed it in. The name came up. Emily kept her face still. "Thanks," she said. "That's all I needed." She walked out of the administrative wing and into the stairwell and stood on the landing for 15 seconds with her back against the wall and the name sitting in her head like a stone, dropped in still water, sending ripples in every direction. Major Patricia Sorrell, Senior Logistics Coordinator. Westbridge Military Medical Center, 14 months. Arrived 3 months before Emily, not Harlan's name. Not anyone on Driscoll's current radar. As far as Emily knew, Because the investigation had been built around Harlan's access, and Harlan's devices and Harlan's contact offshore, and the assumption, the reasonable, evidence-based assumption was that Harlan was the operation. But Harlan was in federal custody, and someone had just slid an anonymous log under a door to tell Emily that someone else had been in the pharmaceutical vault 8 times in 26 days taking concentrated potassium chloride, pulled out her phone and called the number she'd been using. It rang 3 times and then connected. Sorrell, she said. Patricia Sorrell, Senior Logistics. She has access to medication authorizations, personnel routing, and the pharmaceutical annex. KCL count in the controlled vault is short by 14 units. Check her credential access against Harlan's timeline. I think they were running parallel tracks. Pause on the other end. Then how did you get that name? Anonymous source, Emily. Anonymous source, she repeated. But the access log is real and the shelf count is real, and you have the tools to verify both faster than I can. She paused. Someone in this building sent me that log. Someone who isn't Sorrell and isn't Harlan. Someone who knew something was wrong and couldn't come forward directly. Another pause longer. Where are you now? Stairwell B, 3rd floor. Don't move. Don't contact anyone else. I'm sending Okafor. The line went dead. Emily stood in the stairwell and listened to the building around her. The hum of the HVAC, the distant sound of the ward. Somewhere below her, the regular sound of a facility that didn't know yet that the threat it had been managing for 2 days had a second layer. Okafor arrived in 4 minutes, which was fast enough that she'd clearly been close. What happened in the next 3 hours happened in segments. The way crisis management always did, fast intervals of action broken by waiting, broken by more action. The whole sequence stitched together by people who were very good at staying functional under pressure, and the particular institutional functioner machinery that activated when something federal and serious was in motion. Driscoll was briefed on Sorrell within 18 minutes of Emily's call. The pharmaceutical shelf was documented and sealed within 30. Sorrell's credential access was pulled and cross-referenced with Harlan's timeline within 45 minutes, and what it showed was not parallel tracks, but a relay. Harlan had created the infrastructure, the devices, the comms breach. Sorrell had been managing a separate but coordinated element, slow-build pharmaceutical accumulation, that had nothing to do with the ventilation devices and everything to do with a specific patient whose name Emily still didn't have clearance to know. She found out the shape of it at 11 p.m. When Driscoll sat down across from her in the briefing room, just the two of them, no tablet, no Okafor, no federal man, and said, "There's a patient in the secure ward. Admitted 4 days ago under a restricted access protocol. Someone wanted him not to survive his admission." Emily absorbed this. Sorrell had access to his medication schedule, Driscoll continued. She'd been repositioning stock in the annex. Small amounts across multiple visits, staying under the automated flag threshold. She paused. If whoever tipped you off hadn't moved tonight, we would have closed Harlan's case and missed her entirely. Do you know who tipped me off? We have a theory. Driscoll looked at the table for a moment. One of Harlan's administrative staff. A younger officer who we think became aware of Sorrell's activity independently of Harlan's operation. They weren't coordinated, which is part of why it was hard to see. Harlan was running one play, Sorrell was running another. They were serving the same offshore interest from different angles. And the administrative officer couldn't come to us directly because she'd had access to Harlan's materials and was afraid of implication. Driscoll looked up. She calculated that an anonymous lead to you was her cleanest option. Emily thought about that. About a young officer in a building under modified lockdown, holding information that could implicate her. Deciding that the nurse who'd walked into a room with an aggressive K9 and come out with a credible threat assessment was the person to trust. She made a good call, Emily said. She did. Driscoll was quiet for a moment. Sorrell is being detained now. The secure ward patient has been moved and his medication protocol is being reconstructed from scratch. Paused again, and this pause had a different quality, more deliberate, like she was approaching something she'd been thinking about for a while. The anonymous tip. The pharmaceutical audit. You ran that yourself in the middle of a lockdown, without authorization, and then called it in rather than taking it to the security desk or to Hale, Emily said. Why? She thought about how to answer honestly. Because the security desk might have routed it through channels that included Sorrell before anyone knew her name. And Hale doesn't have operational context. She met Driscoll's eyes. I knew who to call. Driscoll looked at her for a long time. The Admiral left something with me before he departed, she said. Beyond the envelope he gave you. She slid a card across the table, plain white, a phone number handwritten on it, nothing else. When you've made your decision, Call that number. Not me, not the unregistered line, that number. Emily looked at the card. What happens when I call it? She asked. A conversation, Driscoll said, about what comes next. She went back to the ward at midnight because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and standing still had never been her best skill. The night shift was quiet. Her regular patients were stable. She checked in on the young specialist who'd done his lapse asleep. Vitals good. The knee draining appropriately, and stood in the doorway of his room for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing. 19 years old. Scared of the pain. Asking if it gets easier. She thought about what she'd told him. Yes. Which was true. Which was also the incomplete version of the truth. Because what she hadn't said was that easier didn't mean lighter. It meant you got better at carrying things without letting them pull you sideways. She finished her round. Sat at the nurse's station and looked at the card Driscoll had given her. Then she looked at the Admiral's envelope in her other pocket. She'd read the reinstatement offer 4 times in the K9 suite. She knew what it said. The unit, the structure, the assignment, a joint medical and special operations role that would use both halves of what she was, not asking her to fold one away to make room for the other. The kind of position that didn't officially exist in any directory, and that was created because someone somewhere had decided that the specific combination of skills she had was worth maintaining in active service. That someone had been watching Westbridge for longer than 2 days. She put the card on the desk in front of her, put the Admiral's envelope beside it. They sat there under the station's fluorescent light, 2 pieces of paper, representing 2 different futures, and she was tired enough that the thinking felt slow, and the slow thinking felt like honesty. At 1:30 a.m., Mulvane appeared at the nurse's station. She hadn't seen him since the morning briefing. He looked like someone who'd been through several more conversations than one person should have in a single day, and he sat down in the chair across from her, without being invited, which she took as a sign that his social proprieties had finally been worn through. Sorrel, he said. I know. I worked with her for 8 months. He shook his head. The motion wasn't dramatic, just a man trying to dislodge something that was sitting wrong. Logistics meetings. Planning sessions. She brought coffee to a planning session once. Emily didn't say anything. How does that happen, he asked, not rhetorically asking. Carefully, she said, over a long time, by someone who understands that the best cover is being unremarkable. He looked at the desk. We almost missed it. You didn't miss it. You didn't miss it, he said. That's different. Picked up her pen, put it down again. People were watching things they were told to watch. That's not the same as ignoring things, it's just limited field of view. Coda had a wider field of view. Mulvane was quiet for a moment. Dog, he said, for the second time, with a completely different quality than the first. Yes. He stood up. Looked like he was going to leave, then didn't. I was hard on you the first night. You had a soldier with an injured arm, and a dog that had just destroyed a door panel. You made a reasonable call. I dismissed what you said. Yes. He absorbed that. The acknowledgement without cushioning, and the fact that she wasn't going to make it comfortable for him by disagreeing. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone who wanted me to know I was wrong. She looked at him steadily. Being right isn't the same thing as winning, she said. The mission was finding the threat. Everything else is overhead. He left after that. She thought it was probably one of the more useful conversations he'd had all day, which set a somewhat bleak standard for his day overall. 3 a.m., she went back to the K9 suite. Coda was in his kennel, door open, lying on his side in the particular loose-limbed way that dogs sleep when they're genuinely at rest rather than monitoring. She checked his dressing. She was going to change it properly in the morning. Clean suture line, good healing margins, and crouched beside the kennel and just looked at him for a moment. He opened one eye, closed it again. Big week, she told him. Tail moved once. She stayed there for 10 minutes, which was longer than she could justify clinically and exactly as long as she needed. There was something in the particular quietness of a working dog at rest that she'd always found more settling than any deliberate attempt at calm the animal reality of it. The body that did hard things and then simply stopped and breathed. When she stood up, she'd made her decision. She knew that she had made it before she sat down, probably. Maybe before the Admiral handed her the envelope. Maybe before Driscoll handed her the card. Maybe when she was standing in the pharmaceutical annex 6 hours ago, looking at an empty shelf, counting the missing units with her phone camera, and her hands completely steady, not because she was unbothered, but because steadiness was what the moment needed, and she knew how to give it. She went back to the nurse's station, picked up the card, looked at the number. Then she picked up her personal phone. not the staff line, and dialed. It rang once. "Carter," said the voice on the other end. Not a question. "I need to talk about the assignment," she said. "Go ahead. I have conditions." A brief pause. Expected. "Coda and Vane. I want them as the integrated unit on any K9 component of my assignment. I've worked with both of them now, and the operational relationship is already established." She paused. "I also want my nursing credentials to remain active and on record as concurrent with whatever operational role I take. I'm not leaving clinical work, I'm adding to it." Silence on the other end. Not long, 5 seconds. Maybe 6. "The first condition is negotiable through the appropriate channels," the voice said. "The second one is already written into the offer. Page 3. She looked at the envelope on the desk. She'd read it 4 times and hadn't gotten to page 3 because she hadn't realized there was a page 3. The first sheet had seemed complete. She opened the envelope, pulled out the document. There was a page 3. She read it. It said, among other things, that the role specifically required concurrent maintenance of civilian medical licensure and that active clinical work was considered a functional component of the assignment rather than a personal accommodation. Whoever had written this had known her better than she'd given them credit for. "All right," she said. "All right, you're accepting? All right, I'll call back in 48 hours with a formal answer." "I said I needed 48 hours and I meant it." She paused. "But I'm no longer undecided." Another brief silence. Then something that might have been the beginning of something warmer. "Understood. We'll be expecting your call." The line went dead. Emily put her phone down, put the document back in the envelope, put the envelope in her locker at the end of the hall, between her spare scrub top and the running shoes she kept there for the long shifts. Then she went back to the station and finished her charting for the night. The formal charge documentation on Harlan and Sorrell was filed through federal channels at 600, which Emily knew about because Driscoll sent her a brief, factual message at 605 confirming that both individuals were in federal custody and that the investigation record was closed pending trial. "Your account is part of the formal record," Driscoll added. "Your service file access has been updated to reflect current clearance. You'll see the change when you next log in." Emily was already on her morning shift when the message came. She was in the middle of changing Coda's dressing properly this time. Clean technique. New gauze, the surgical site looking genuinely good, another 5 days, and he'd be ready for graduated weight bearing, and she read the message with one hand while Coda held himself perfectly still, which she was beginning to understand was his version of cooperation and trust expressed simultaneously. Vane was in the doorway. He'd taken to stopping by in the mornings, which was partly handler protocol, and partly something else she hadn't named yet. "How's he looking?" he asked. "Good, really good." She finished taping the dressing. "He can start supervised walking by the end of the week. Nothing extended yet, nothing on uneven terrain, but he'll get restless if he's not moving." "He's already restless, I know." "It's a good sign." She stood. Dripped her gloves. "Driscoll filed the charges this morning." "I heard." Vane leaned against the doorframe. He had the careful expression of someone who had slept approximately 4 hours and made peace with it. "How are you doing with all of it?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm okay," she said. "I think I'm actually okay." She paused. "Which is its own strange thing. Because you expected not to be. Because I've been in situations where okay was a long time coming." She looked at Coda, who was watching Vane with the alert attention he gave, the person he trusted most. This one moved fast. Vane nodded. He understood that. She thought the particular disorientation of a crisis that resolves before you've finished preparing for it to be worse. "What happens now?" he asked. She picked up her supply bag. "For you and Coda, another week of recovery, and then the clearance process for return to duty." She moved toward the door, and he stepped aside to let her through. "For me," she stopped, considered. "I have a phone call to make in 47 hours. He looked at her. The recalibration again, the look that had become familiar over the last 2 days. "Am I going to see you around?" he asked. "That depends on some decisions that are still being made," she said, and caught the faint echo of the Admiral's words as she said it, and thought that was probably the most honest answer available. She walked back toward the ward. The morning shift was assembling. The day's patient load was standard 2 post-ops, 3 recovery monitoring cases, the ongoing charts that accumulated in any medical unit like sediment. Normal work. The kind she was good at and had chosen deliberately, and was not, she understood now, going to leave behind. She was halfway through her first chart of the morning when Hale appeared in the corridor outside the station. He walked with the same authority he always did, but there was something different in his face, not softer, exactly, but less defended. A man who had updated his operating assumptions and was still adjusting to the new parameters. Stopped at the station. "I've been informed," he said, "that your service record has been updated and that your involvement in the security resolution of this incident will be formally documented in the facility record." "I know," she said. "I've also been informed that there may be changes in your situation here in the near term. Possibly." He was quiet for a moment. Then Westbridge would be losing a good clinician. Coming from Hale, that was a paragraph. "I know that too," she said. He nodded once, the smallest possible nod, and walked away. And Emily turned back to her chart and wrote 3 clear, precise notes about a patient's drainage output, because that was the work in front of her, and she had always been better at doing the work in front of her than almost anything else. 4 p.m. 17 hours before her 48 hours were up. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She didn't recognize not the Admiral's line, not Driscoll, not her usual contact. A number she'd never seen. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Nurse Carter." The voice was male, older, with the particular compressed quality of someone speaking on a secured line from a significant distance. "I'm told you're deciding." "I'm told I have 47 hours, she said. "You do. I'm not calling to pressure you." A pause. "I'm calling because there's something you should know before you decide. Something that wasn't in the documentation." She stopped walking, found a quiet corner of the corridor. "The 2 compromised missions," the voice said. "The ones whose timelines Harlan transmitted." "Yes. One of them has been successfully rerouted. Personnel are secure." Another pause. "The second one." He stopped. The stop had weight. "The second mission timeline was already in motion when we identified the breach. We couldn't pull them back in time." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" she said. 3 people are missing," the voice said. 6 hours ago. We don't know their status." He paused again. "Their last known position was consistent with the transmitted intelligence. Someone was waiting for them." The corridor was very quiet around her. "Why are you telling me this?" she said, though she already knew. "Because the role you're considering," the voice said, "exists specifically to prevent this from happening again. Not in the abstract. In specific terms, with specific operations, with people whose names you'd know and whose lives are affected by exactly the kind of threat you identified here over the last 48 hours. He let that land. "I'm not telling you to change your decision. I'm telling you what the decision is actually about." Stood in the corridor for a moment after he finished speaking. Looked at the wall in front of her. Plain hospital paint. Fluorescent light. The distant sound of the ward doing its regular, necessary, life-maintaining work. 3 people. Missing. Because a man with 22 years of institutional trust had decided that trust had a market value. "I understand," she said. "I know you do," the voice said. "Why I called you." The line went dead. Emily stood in the corridor for another 10 seconds. Then she pulled out the card Driscoll had given her. The Admiral's number. She had 47 hours. She called it anyway. It rang twice, and on the second ring, she heard the line open, and she took a breath and opened her mouth to speak, and her pager went off. She looked at it reflexively, the way nurses do. The muscle memory of 14 months overriding everything else. Patient emergency. Room 7. The same room number where Coda had first alerted 2 nights ago. And the coincidence of it registered somewhere in the back of her mind as she was already moving toward the ward, because a person was in distress, and the decision could wait 30 seconds. She pushed through the ward door. The room was crowded, 2 nurses already inside. A crash cart in the doorway. The monitor showing a rhythm she recognized immediately, and that sent a cold, precise recognition through her before she'd fully processed anything else. Patient in room 7, the one Driscoll had told her about. Cure ward patient who'd been moved. Moved she'd assumed safely. She'd assumed to a different facility. She'd assumed the threat was neutralized when Sorrell was detained. Patient in room 7 was not the secure ward patient. Patient in room 7 was the young specialist. 19 years old. Knee surgery, 2 laps of the corridor. Scared of the pain and asking if it gets easier. And the monitor above his bed was showing a rhythm that had no business being in a 19-year-old's chest after a routine orthopedic procedure, unless something had gotten into his IV line that shouldn't be there. Emily was at the bedside in 4 steps. "When did this start?" she said. "Maybe 3 minutes ago he called the call button," said he felt. "What's his last potassium?" "It was normal this morning, 4.1. She looked at the IV line, looked at the bag hanging above the bed, looked at the secondary port on the line, the small rubber access point halfway down the tubing. It was wet, freshly wet. Someone had accessed it recently, in the last few minutes. While the ward was in its afternoon rhythm, and nobody was specifically watching a 19-year-old recovering from knee surgery because he was stable and low risk and completely unremarkable. The same way Patricia Sorrell had been unremarkable for 8 months. Emily looked at the monitor, looked at the line, looked at the specialist's face pale, eyes half open, confused in the specific way that was not surgical pain, but something metabolic, something shifting. "Get me calcium gluconate," she said now. And pull the line, replace the whole line, new bag, new tubing, touch nothing on the old setup. Why calcium? Because someone accessed that port, and I'm not waiting for a potassium level to confirm it. Her voice was flat and certain. Move, they moved. She kept her hand steady. She did the work. She did not think about the decision, or the Admiral's number still open on her phone in her pocket, or the 3 people missing because someone somewhere had decided that lives had a different value than the one everyone else assigned to them. She thought only about the 19-year-old in front of her, and the monitor, and the next 30 seconds, and the one after that. But somewhere in the facility, Coda began to bark. And this time, the barking was not coming from the K9 suite. The barking was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately locate. Not the location she registered that immediately. Somewhere in the building below her, sublevel corridor by the acoustic quality of it, the way sound bounced differently off concrete than off the tile and drywall of the upper floors. What was wrong was the pattern. This wasn't the sustained alerting from the first night, the systematic report of a dog pointing at a fixed location. This was movement tracking, short bursts, repositioning, the rhythm of a working dog following something in real time. Coda was not supposed to be on sublevel anything. Coda was supposed to be in his kennel 3 floors up, post-surgical, non-weight-bearing for another 5 days. Emily had 2 tracks running simultaneously, and she did not drop either one. "Calcium gluconate in," the other nurse said. "Good. Watch the rhythm. I need a repeat EKG in 4 minutes, not 5. And pull his medication administration record for the last 6 hours. Everything. Every access." She was already stepping back from the bedside, because the specialist's color was already marginally better, the calcium, working as a cardiac membrane stabilizer, buying them time to confirm what was in the line, and she had 2 nurses who could manage the next 3 minutes if they stayed focused. "Don't let anyone else access this room. Nobody not on this ward. You pull the door and you badge it, and if anyone without this ward's credentials tries to enter, you call security first and ask questions. Second." The nurse stared at her. "Do you understand?" Emily said. "Yes." "Good." She was in the hallway. She hit the stairwell at a run, not a nurse's controlled hurry, an actual run. The kind her body remembered from a different context and found again without difficulty. 3 flights down. The sublevel corridor was maintenance and storage, and the pharmaceutical annex and a secondary utilities section that ran behind the facility's eastern infrastructure. The same eastern infrastructure that connected, by ventilation duct, to the east wing above. She hissed the sublevel door and pushed through into fluorescent light and concrete and the smell of industrial cleaner, and 30 feet down the corridor, she could see Coda. He was moving on 3 legs with a controlled urgency that made her chest clench, not because he was struggling, exactly, but because the way he was moving was deliberate and precise, and he absolutely should not be putting any weight on that rear leg. Not yet. Not for days. And he was tracking something toward the pharmaceutical annex at the end of the corridor, and beside him, running to keep up, was Vane. Vane saw her. He didn't stop. "You got out," Vane said as she reached them, the words clipped and functional. "I don't know how the kennel door, the suite door, both were secured. Came in for the late check, and he was gone." His expression was taut. "I've been following him for 4 minutes. He's going to tear that suture line. I know he won't stop." She looked at Coda. The dog was focused forward, not on her, not on Vane, on something ahead of them at the end of the corridor, where the pharmaceutical annex door sat closed and badged and theoretically sealed since she'd photographed the shelf 6 hours ago. The badge reader beside the door had a green light. It should have had a red one. The annex had been sealed by Driscoll's team. Sealed meant no access, red light, credential lockout. Someone had overridden it. "Call Driscoll," Emily said, and she was already moving. Right now. Sublevel corridor, pharmaceutical annex. Vane had his phone out before she finished the sentence. She reached the annex door, pressed herself against the wall beside it, the way she'd pressed herself against a wall exactly once before in her life, in a different corridor, in a different country, different stakes that felt at the time like the entirety of what stakes could be. The body remembered. The breath steadied. The hands stayed where she needed them. She looked at Coda. He was sitting now, pressed against the wall on the opposite side of the door, his damaged leg extended, his eyes on the door with the focused stillness of a dog in a final alert position. He'd done his job. He was telling her, "Here." She reached across and hit the door handle, pushed it open and went in low to the left, the way you entered a room when you didn't know what was inside and you needed to deny an easy angle. Patricia Sorrell was standing at the back of the pharmaceutical annex, with a supply bag open on the counter and her hands in the controlled substance cabinet that was supposed to be locked and wasn't. She turned when the door opened. She looked at Emily. She looked at Coda in the doorway. For 3 full seconds, no one moved, and in those 3 seconds, Emily cataloged everything she needed. Sorrell's position, the open bag, the contents of the cabinet within reach, the distance between them, the fact that Sorrell was not armed with anything visible, and that her hands were above the counter, and that the expression on her face had gone through shock and arrived somewhere past it, in the flat, stripped territory of a person who has run out of contingencies. "You were already detained," Emily said. "I was released pending formal processing." Sorrell's voice was steady, which was more composure than Emily would have credited her with. "Still have facility credentials. Your credentials were supposed to be suspended." Supposed to be. A small tight movement at the corner of her mouth. There was a lag in the system update. 22 minutes. "I've been counting on that lag for 3 weeks. Emily stayed where she was. "Whatever you're taking out of that cabinet, put it down." "I can't do that." "You can. You don't understand what I'm managing." Sorrell's eyes moved briefly to Coda, then back. "Patient I was assigned to protect, not harm. Protect is still in this facility. The rerouting your investigation team did was inadequate. Still at risk. From a direction you haven't identified. And the only way to keep him stable through the next 12 hours is to manage his chemistry manually, because the official protocol is compromised, and I can't tell anyone that without exposing." She stopped. Emily looked at her. She processed the syntax of what Sorrell had just said. "The patient I was assigned to protect." "You're not working with Harlan," Emily said slowly. "I was never working with Harlan." Sorrell's jaw tightened. "I was working against what Harlan was doing, but I couldn't surface it directly without identifying my own access. And my access." She stopped again. Something crossed her face that was more complicated than a person getting caught. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying 2 opposing things for a very long time and was exhausted all the way through. "My access was not entirely sanctioned. I was running a parallel protective operation on an asset your investigation didn't know existed until 6 hours ago. The pharmaceutical shelf. The missing KCL, which Emily had read as a weapon being assembled." She looked at the supply bag. Looked at what was on the counter. Not just KCL, a full resuscitation profile, multiple compounds, the kind of preparation you made when you needed to counteract a specific pharmacological threat to a specific patient-specific physiology. She looked at Sorrell's hands. They were not the hands of a person building something. They were the hands of a clinician preparing an intervention. "Show me your authorization," Emily said. "I told you it's not fully sanctioned. Show me what you have." Sorrell reached slowly into her jacket pocket and produced a folded document. Emily crossed the room and took it without breaking eye contact, then looked down. It was a directive. Classified header, the same level as the Admiral's envelope. The same reference series. Authorizing Patricia Sorrell under a lateral operational role Emily didn't have a category for, to maintain covert protective pharmacological oversight of a specific patient. The patient number matched the secure ward admission Driscoll had mentioned, the one who'd been moved. And at the bottom, countersigned by an authority Emily recognized. The same admiral who had handed her an envelope in the K9 suite 6 hours ago. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Sorrell and said, "He didn't tell me." "Compartmentalizes everything," Sorrell said, with a bitterness that was also respect. "I've been working this assignment for 11 weeks. Nobody knows the full picture. That's the design." "The anonymous log," Emily said. "Under the door." Sorrell looked at her steadily. "I needed you looking at the right person." "Harlan." "Not me," she paused. "I underestimated how fast you'd follow the thread back." Emily stood in the middle of the pharmaceutical annex, with a classified directive in one hand, and Coda 2 feet behind her, and Vane in the doorway with his phone at his ear, and she let the full, ungainly, complicated shape of the last 48 hours rearrange itself around this new piece. "Harlan." The real threat. Caught. Sorel, a parallel operation. Unsanctioned in form, but authorized in substance. Protecting an asset nobody had told Emily about, because nobody told anyone more than they needed. And a 19-year-old specialist 3 floors up whose IV line had been accessed by someone who was not Patricia Sorel. Then who accessed the line in room 7? Emily said. Sorel's composure cracked for the first time. A fracture? Small? Across the controlled surface of her face. What line? Post-surgical patient. Orthopedic ward. Someone accessed his IV port 20 minutes ago. Cardiac response consistent with potassium chloride injection. Sorel went very still. That's not my patient, she said. Quiet, certain. That's not the asset. That's her eyes moved, rapid calculating. That's incidental. That's someone covering a trail. Trail. Harlan has a contact inside this facility who wasn't identified in the investigation. Sorel moved fast now, closing the supply bag, the clinical preparedness back on her face. Someone who knew the channels were closing and needed a distraction. Or a message. Vane stepped into the room. He'd ended his call. Driscoll is 3 minutes out, he said. And the specialist upstairs is stable, repeat. EKG shows the rhythm normalizing. Emily exhaled one controlled breath. 1. The calcium worked, she said. Yeah. Vane looked between her and Sorel. You want to explain what I'm looking at? Later, Emily said. Right now I need to know if there's a third person in this building who hasn't been detained. Driscoll arrived with 4 people and a containment protocol that Emily had not seen deployed before, which was its own indicator of severity. She took in the pharmaceutical annex scene. Emily Sorel, the open cabinet. Coda sitting with his damaged leg extended and his focus absolute with the expressionless efficiency of a person updating a mental map in real time. Sorel, Driscoll said. She's authorized, Emily said. Different channel. Same authority. She held out the directive. Driscoll read it. Her face moved in ways that were small and controlled and communicated a significant amount of internal recalibration. She handed it to Okafor without comment. There's a third actor, Emily said. Someone inside the facility Harlan's investigation missed. They accessed a patient's IV line on the orthopedic wardroom 7 approximately 30 minutes ago. Patient is stable. The line has been replaced, and the original is in evidence. I need you to pull the ward badge access log for the last 40 minutes and cross-reference it against everyone you've already cleared. Driscoll was already on her radio. How did you know to come down here? She asked without pausing the radio call. Emily looked at Coda. Driscoll followed her gaze. Looked at the dog. Looked at his rear leg, which he was continuing to hold at an angle that was going to require Emily's attention in approximately the next 3 minutes, regardless of what else was happening. He got out of the suite, Driscoll said. He got out of the suite, Vane confirmed, with the tone of a man who was still processing this and had not finished. Driscoll looked at Coda for a long moment with an expression Emily couldn't fully read, something between professional acknowledgement and something more human, the look of someone confronting evidence that their model of a situation was less complete than they'd thought. Get him back upstairs, Driscoll said finally. Get his leg looked at. She met Emily's eyes. I'll handle the annex and the ward log. You've done enough. Find the third person, Emily said. We will. Before they leave the building. Driscoll held her gaze. I said we will. Coda had not torn the suture line. Emily checked it twice in the K9 suite, with better light and clean hands and the particular thoroughness of someone who needed to confirm good news before she'd accept it. The surgical repair was intact. The wound edges were clean. He'd moved on that leg for the better part of 15 minutes through concrete sub-level corridors, and he'd managed it with the specific, compensated precision of a trained animal who understood his own body's limits and had decided the mission required operating at the edge of them. The muscle would be sore. She'd managed that. Everything else was intact. Vane sat on the floor while she worked and didn't say much, which was the right call. There was a lot sitting in the room that didn't need words yet. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. He's going to be okay, she said. Vane's exhale was slow and long.
Yeah.
His recovery timeline just extended by 2 days. Maybe 3. She looked at Coda, who had put his head down on Vane's knee, with the finality of a dog who had finished for the night. He needs to actually rest now, he will. Vane ran his hand along Coda's flank. He always does this. does the thing, and then just stops. Like a switch. Smart, she said, smarter than me most days. She looked at the east wall, the replacement grate cover, the empty space where everything had started. Driscoll's going to find the third person, she said. Not a question. Probably already has, Vane said. She's very good at what she does. So is Sorrel, it turns out. Vane looked at her. Did you know? When you went into the annex? No, she was honest about it. I thought she was the threat until about 90 seconds in. She paused. It was wrong. You were working with incomplete information. So was everyone. That's not the same as an excuse. She stood up, straightened her scrubs. I misread her. The shelf, the credential access, I built a picture that fit the evidence I had, and it was the wrong picture. She looked at Coda. He knew. He went to her because she wasn't the threat. She was moving toward something that needed to be found. Vane was quiet for a moment. He doesn't make moral judgments, he said. He reads what's real. Who's actually dangerous, who's actually scared, what's actually wrong. He looked at the dog. Complicated. She thought about that. About all the ways she'd been correct and incorrect in the last 48 hours. The things she'd known and the things she'd filled in. The gaps between actual evidence and the story she'd built to connect it. The ways being right about some things had almost made her wrong about something that mattered. Yeah, she said, we do. The third person was found at 11:47 p. M. His name was Corporal Dennis Farrow, 26 years old, support staff, attached to administrative services for 8 months. He had been, at various points over those 8 months, invisible in exactly the way that Patricia Sorrel had been invisible present, unremarkable, doing a job that no one looked at closely because there was nothing about him that invited close looking. He'd been at the access point for the service elevator on sublevel 2 when Driscoll's team closed the corridor. He had a bag. In the bag was a credentials cloning device, and 3 syringes, 2 empty and 1 not. The not empty one contained a concentration of potassium chloride that forensic analysis would later confirm matched the deficit from the pharmaceutical annex, not the units Sorrel had handled, the other units. The ones missing from the secondary cabinet that Emily hadn't checked because she'd found what she was looking for in the first one and stopped. He'd accessed that secondary cabinet 4 hours before Sorrel went downstairs. 4 hours. The lag in Driscoll's access log cross-reference had caught Sorrel's movement and missed his because his credential had been cloned from an active personnel badge whose owner was currently on authorized leave and hadn't been flagged as a potential vector because the investigation wasn't looking for cloned credentials. He hadn't been working for Harlan. He'd been working for the same offshore contact as Harlan, same interest, different handler, different role. Harlan had compromised intelligence. Sorrel had been protecting against the consequence of that compromise. Farrow had been sent to complete what the intelligence compromise was designed to enable, the elimination of the patient in the secure ward, now rerouted, and when that became inaccessible, a secondary target chosen for visibility. A 19-year-old recovering from knee surgery whose death on a military medical ward would send a message that the operation could reach anywhere. Emily learned all of this in segments over the next 4 hours, the way she'd learned everything else in pieces, from different directions, assembling the complete picture later. She was still on shift when the last piece arrived. She was charting at the nurse's station at 2 a.m., running on something past tiredness that didn't have a clean name, and Driscoll appeared in the corridor and said, "It's done," in a way that meant something more than the immediate situation. "Farrow," Emily said, "in custody. Full confession, which is unusual, but he's apparently decided cooperation is his best option." Driscoll sat down in the chair across from her, which Emily had also never seen her do. "The offshore contact has been identified and is now a matter for international channels, which is above both our pay grades." She paused. "Cure ward patient has been transferred to a facility with an appropriate protection detail. Stable. And the 2 compromised missions." Driscoll's face moved. "One team is confirmed safe, rerouted successfully. The second team..." She stopped. "1 person is still unaccounted for. 2 have been recovered." Emily absorbed that. 1 person. Still out there somewhere. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. "No," Driscoll said, and then after a beat, "Not for that. Not from here." She looked at the desk. That's a different kind of work. Emily looked at the Admiral's card in her pocket. She could feel its edge through the fabric. I know, she said. The formal debrief happened 3 days later, in a conference facility 40 miles from Westbridge that was not attached to any institution Emily was cleared to name. Driscoll ran it. The federal man was there, and Okafor, and two people Emily hadn't met who asked precise questions and wrote down the answers with the focused attention of people who were building something official from the material. Sorrel was there too, across the table with her own counsel and her own account. The session had the functional awkwardness of two people who had been briefly on opposite sides of the same operations sitting in the same room, trying to construct a coherent record. They managed it. Neither of them was graceful about it, and neither of them pretended to be, which Emily suspected was the best available outcome. The record showed, when assembled, was this: Harlan had created the breach. Farrow had been positioned to use it. Sorrel had been working to prevent the consequence of both, without adequate coordination or authorization, in a way that had nearly been misidentified as a third threat. And Emily had identified the initial alert, contained Harlan before he could reach the primary witness, uncovered Sorrel's pharmaceutical activity, stabilized a patient who had been targeted, located Farrow's secondary target, and triggered the response that led to his apprehension. All of this while working a nursing shift. The person at the end of the table who was taking the official record paused at that point and asked her to repeat the last part. Repeated it. He wrote it down. She watched him write it and felt, for the first time, the complete strangeness of her own situation, not pride. Exactly. Not the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction she'd have liked to feel. Something more mixed. The knowledge that she'd been right about some things and wrong about others, and that the outcome had been good despite the places where she'd been wrong, which was not a comfortable formula. She'd rather have been right about everything. She was experienced enough to know that wasn't how it worked. She'd stabilized a 19-year-old who was 19 years old, and that was real, regardless of everything else. Hale requested a meeting with her on the fourth day, in his office, with the door closed. He'd done something different with the room in the intervening days, moved some things, she thought, though she couldn't have specified exactly what. Feeling of it was less formal, or maybe Hale was less formal, and the room was the same. He sat across from her, not behind his desk. That was new. I've been informed that you're considering a new assignment, he said. Yes. And that Westbridge would be part of your rotation. Not your primary posting, but a regular presence, she said. Still carry patients here. The assignment has a clinical component that requires maintained hospital access. He nodded. I've been asked to sign off on a formal arrangement. I wanted you to know that I'm signing it. He paused. Without conditions. She looked at him. You were right about the dog, he said. You were right about Harlan. You were right about the IV line. He said each one separately, with the deliberate weight of a man who was not in the habit of accounting for his mistakes and was doing it anyway. I built a category for you when you walked into this building 14 months ago, and I put you in it and I didn't look again. He met her eyes. That's on me. You had no reason to look, she said. I didn't give you one. I'm a doctor. Giving me a reason shouldn't be the patient's job. He said patient, and she thought he meant something broader. I should ask better questions. She thought about the young specialist, about asking if it gets easier, about the answer she'd given. For what it's worth, she said, the clinical work here has been some of the best I've done. Patients are complicated and the cases don't let you be lazy, and that matters. She paused. I'll be back. He nodded once, then quietly, I'm glad. It was the most human thing she'd ever heard him say. On the morning of the 5th day, the SEAL team held what they called an informal commendation, informal meaning no ceremony, no auditorium, no speeches with a podium. It was in the facility's rear courtyard, 7 people standing in the early morning light, the desert air carrying its particular quality of space and distance. Driscoll was there. Mulvane. Okafor. Vane. 3 members of Bravo team that Emily was meeting for the first time. Men who had clearly been briefed on what happened and who had the focused, assessing quality of people, who took the measure of things and updated their assessments when the evidence required it. And Coda, on a leash beside Vane, who had been cleared for supervised outdoor time that morning in what Emily suspected was a medical decision Vane had influenced more than she'd technically authorized. There was no formal script. Driscoll spoke briefly. She was not a woman who embellished, and said that the record had been documented, the commendation filed, and that the people present understood better than most what the last 5 days had actually contained. Then Vane stepped forward and presented Emily with something small, a challenge coin, military issue, the weight of it solid and familiar in her palm. She looked at it, the SEAL team insignia on one side. On the other engraved K9 Bravo. She listened. She closed her hand around it. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't wired for speeches. She looked at the faces in front of her. Mulvane, who had told her to stay out of the room and come back 4 hours later to tell her she'd been right. Driscoll, who had run a parallel operation in a crisis response and somehow kept both functional. Vane, who had followed a dog down 3 flights of stairs without stopping to ask why. The Bravo team members she didn't know, but whose work existed in the same world as hers, and she said the thing that felt true. He did the work, she said. She looked at Coda. I just listened. Coda sat at Vane's side with his damaged leg extended and his ears forward, and his eyes on Emily with the steady, present attention she'd learned over 5 days meant something specific. Not alerting, not tracking, just seeing her. The way working dogs see the people they've decided to trust, fully and without reservation. Vane gave the leash a small amount of slack. Coda walked to her. 3-legged, careful, unhurried. He pressed his nose to her palm. 2 seconds. Exact. She put her hand on his head. She made the formal call at 800 on the 6th day. The Admiral answered on the 2nd ring. Carter, he said. I'm accepting, she said, under the conditions I outlined. Already documented. A pause. Vane and Coda are being processed for the integrated unit assignment. I thought you'd want to know. She looked out the window of the break room at the facility yard, where the desert light was doing what it did in the early morning, making everything look clarified and possible. The missing team member, she said, the one still unaccounted for. Pause. Longer than any pause he'd given her before. Still unaccounted for, he said. She had expected that. She'd hoped not to, but she'd expected it. When I'm on assignment, that case is ongoing, he said, and it will be part of the operational landscape you're entering. Another pause. The honest answer. I know, she said. I'm not asking for different. I'm asking so I know where it is. He was quiet for a moment. You'll know where it is, he said. I'll make sure of it. Call ended. She put the phone in her pocket. The challenge coin was already there, heavy and small, the engraving on the back pressing against her fingertip, when she closed her hand around it. She listened. She worked the morning shift because she was still on rotation, and the patients still needed their morning medications, and she did it the way she always had, room by room, methodical, checking charts and checking people, and giving the work her full attention because it deserved it, and they deserved it, and that had been true yesterday and was true today and would be true next week, and the week after that, regardless of what else was happening. The young specialist was being discharged. She was doing his discharge paperwork when he asked, Is it true? What people are saying happened here this week? She looked at him. What are people saying? That there was some kind of security thing? Something with a dog. He looked at her with the open, earnest attention of a 19-year-old who is still young enough to believe that asking direct questions gets direct answers, and that you were involved. She handed him his discharge summary. Your follow-up appointment is in 2 weeks. Don't push the knee before week 4. He looked at the papers. Looked at her. You're not going to tell me. I'm going to tell you your physical therapy schedule. She said it without unkindness. And I'm going to tell you that you did good this week. The walks, the PT, the way you handled a complication that scared you. She met his eyes. You did good, he absorbed that. Young face, tired eyes. The particular mix of someone who'd been through something and was still sorting out what it meant. Does it get easier? He asked. The same question as before. She'd given him the short answer last time. She thought he could handle the longer one now. Some of it gets easier, she said. Some of it you just get better at carrying. She paused. Part that doesn't change is knowing why you're carrying it. If you know that, the weight stops being the main thing. He looked at her for a moment. How do you know why? You figure it out by doing the work, she said. There's no shortcut. He nodded slowly, like he was storing it somewhere. She handed him the last form to sign. Her final shift at Westbridge for now, for this rotation, with the understanding that she'd be back-ended at 3 in the afternoon. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, changed into her own clothes, packed the running shoes and the spare top she'd kept in the locker for 14 months into a bag. Stopped in the K9 suite on her way out. Coda was in his kennel, door open, Vane beside him on the floor. They'd both been there this morning, and would apparently both be there this afternoon, which she suspected was going to be the pattern until Coda was cleared for active duty, at which point she guessed neither of them would know what to do with an unstructured afternoon. He's eating well, she said. Wound looks clean. Continue the anti-inflammatories for another 4 days, and watch for swelling above the suture line. Understood, Vane said. And don't let him convince you he's ready for full weight-bearing early. He'll try, he's already tried. He'll try again. I know. Vane looked up at her. He had the expression he'd had in the stairwell that first morning, recalibrating, updating, filing new information into a picture that kept requiring more space. You're going to be in the rotation? Starting in 6 weeks. We'll be back on active duty by then. I know. She looked at Coda, who had opened his eyes when she came in and was watching her with the same focused attention as always. Keep him honest. He keeps me honest, Vane said. It's a mutual arrangement. She crouched beside the kennel. Let Coda come to her 2 seconds, nose to palm, the greeting that had become a language between them. Put her hand on his head, and he leaned into it briefly. The lean of a dog who accepted care from very few people and had decided, for reasons entirely his own, that she was one of them. Good boy, she said. Meant it completely. She stood up, shouldered her bag. Carter, Vane said. She stopped. You said you left the operational work behind when you transitioned out. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him. Did you? Or did you just move it somewhere quieter? She thought about 14 months of careful invisibility, keeping her head down and doing good work and telling herself that was enough, that the folded-away version of herself was better left folded. Of the precise moment she'd heard Coda's barking change quality and known, in the place where knowledge lives before language, exactly what it meant. I moved it somewhere quieter, she said. He nodded. For what it's worth, he said. Both things, the nurse and everything else, they're the same thing. You do both the same way. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I know that now. She walked out of the K9 suite, through the corridor, through the main entrance, into the Nevada afternoon light that hit the desert facility, with a kind of clarity that made everything cast a hard shadow. Stood outside for a moment. The challenge coin was in her pocket. The Admiral's number was in her phone. 6 weeks from now, she'd be somewhere else in a role she'd spent 3 years telling herself she'd left behind, doing work that was harder and more dangerous and more necessary than anything she could have arranged in advance, alongside a handler and a dog who had blown an entire operation open by refusing to be silent when everyone needed him to be quiet. 14 months ago, she'd walked into this building and made herself small, kept her head down, done her job, and her job had been good and real and worth doing. She wasn't revising that. She wasn't going to make the nursing into a placeholder for something more important, because it wasn't. It was half of what she was, the half that kept her human in the specific ways that the other half sometimes couldn't. But she was done making herself small. She pulled out her phone and opened a message thread and typed a brief confirmation to the contact she'd been using all week. Assignment accepted. 6 weeks. The response came back in 30 seconds. Understood. Welcome back. She put the phone in her pocket. She thought about the young specialist asking if it gets easier. She thought about the answer she'd given him, and the longer version she'd given today, and the even longer version she hadn't said, which was this. The question isn't whether the weight gets lighter. The question is whether you're carrying something worth the weight. Because if you are, the carrying stops being the point. Point is what you're protecting. The point is who you keep from harm on the days when nobody else is paying attention, when the dog is the only one in the building who can hear what's wrong, when the person with the most important information is also the person everyone decided to file under not relevant to immediate problem. Point is standing in the room anyway. She put on her sunglasses against the desert glare, started walking. Behind her, inside Westbridge Military Medical Center, a Belgian Malinois settled his chin on his handler's knee and closed his eyes. 5 years old, 4 deployments, a laceration healing cleanly on his rear leg. A commendation in his file that would be updated by the end of the week. It was not finished, neither was she. And sometimes the most important thing that happens in a crisis isn't the arrest or the confession, or the official record filed in triplicate. It's the moment before all of that, when everyone has already decided what's possible and what isn't, and one person who has been quietly, deliberately underestimated their entire career looks at a wall that everyone else walked past and says, "I see what you're pointing at. I hear you. I'm not leaving." That's not heroism in the clean cinematic sense. Something quieter and harder and more durable than that. It's the choice, made over and over, to use everything you are instead of only the parts other people have decided to see. Emily Carter had made that choice at midnight in a corridor with a barking dog and no backup. She'd make it again. That's what the people who underestimated her had never understood, and what she'd finally stopped trying to explain. She wasn't waiting for permission to be both things at once. She never had been.